week ago, the biggest conflict since World War II has begun in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. We have tens of thousands of casualties, and unfortunately there's more to the story, a lot more than what you're hearing on the so-called mainstream media, as this conflict actually began 8 years ago in 2014, when Ukraine had a pro-Russian president called Viktor Yanukovych, who was bribed by the Russian president Vladimir Putin $3 billion to not sign an EU association agreement. And this led to a legitimate people's uprising, lots of protests. They set up street camps in the center, and it was of course funded by the deep state, by CIA, by George Soros, his Open Foundation. So it was a combination of deep state, American money, and genuine popular uprising, which led to a riot and then led to some shooting that occurred in the Maidan Square, in which about 100 innocent civilians died. There was no proper investigation, though the police definitely had a part in it. This led to the president losing his cool and running away to Russia, leaving Ukraine without a legitimate government. There was a temporary government formed in the capital, as well as some Russian-backed militia groups in the east, in the Donbas region, which proclaimed people's republics of Donetsk, Lugansk, and Kharkiv. And these new governments, they stormed the existing administration that was also illegitimate, as the temporary government couldn't appoint them. And they wanted to negotiate with the temporary government about their new status. They wanted to be independent, and they wanted to have a peaceful divorce. The Ukrainian government was, of course, American encouragement. It was Obama and Victoria Nuland at the time decided no, and they started a military operation in the Donbas, which resulted in about 14,000 casualties on both sides. The Ukrainian forces took about half of those people's republics, while Russia intervened very heavily with artillery, airplanes, and they even replaced the leadership there with their own agents. But they held firm in a stalemate, which lasted for about 8 years, while Ukraine beefed up its army. So in 2022, Russia was conducting military exercises on the Ukrainian border near its own bases, but the thing that was different was that they were also training in the Republic of Belarus, which is also a despotic one strongman state that's allied with Russia. So Belarus is located north of Ukraine. So to the surprise of everybody, Russia, under the orders of their illegitimate president Vladimir Putin, ordered an invasion, calling it a special denazification operation of Ukraine. They launched the invasion in the disputed Donetsk regions, as well as from Belarus, to outflank the Ukrainian army from the north and from Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. By denazification, he means installing a pro-Russian government, as many Ukrainian nationalists had some Nazi connections during World War II, with Stepan Bandera being a Nazi puppet for a while until he fell out and ended up leading his own resistance force. So basically, there are a lot of Ukrainian military, like the Right Sector and the Azov Battalion, that use SS symbols, and they are very anti-Semitic, and they have no problem committing war crimes. So Putin made a very broad statement, basically no extreme Ukrainian nationalism. The problem is that the nationalists have quite a lot of support in Ukraine. So they have won elections in the past, in 2004 and in 2014, after the Maidan events. I think the average Georgian should research the history of that region just to familiarize themselves with it, because it's very complicated and very troubled region at the fault line between the West and the East. And in very simple terms, this is like your friends having a very messy divorce and getting into a fight over kids, was someone stabbing each other over custody rights. And that's not the kind of situation where you want to involve yourself on one side, because it's really none of their business. And unfortunately, as one of the German parliamentarians said, that it's kind of the West's fault for dangling Ukraine with ideas that it could join NATO and be part of the West when it's right on Russia's doorsteps. And this was never realistic. Russia would never allow the U.S. to put its rockets on its borders and take away its only warm sea port in Crimea. I can understand that, but I definitely would say they overstepped any kind of complaints they had, because they launched an invasion into regions that were not disputed. They're going for the Ukrainian capital of a democratically elected government, which, as much as we might not like the Soros connection, he did win an election. So I think Russia overstepped any moral authority it had by going beyond the Donbass, because it was only the Donbass regions that were interested in leaving. The rest of Ukraine have a strong sense of identity, and this war, unfortunately, is going to make Ukrainians hate Russians even more, because they're going to blame the shelling of their city on Russians, not on all the foreign meddling in their country, even though Russia is obviously not doing a full assault on the cities as they could, because they're trying to win hearts and minds as well. They're going to try to surround the Ukrainian army and cut off the cities and perhaps lay a siege towards them to minimize casualties. They've even opened up humanitarian corridors in the siege city of Mariupol, telling the civilians to leave, but the Ukrainian government has conscripted every able-bodied male from 14 to 60 to fight, and will not let them leave under penalty of desertion. And they've armed every civilian with weapons. Only women and children and very young children are allowed to leave. So Ukraine is trying to make this conflict as bloody as possible, so they can receive more international aid, more weapons, more money, of course, and a higher prestige, because they're already getting fast-tracked to be in the European Union. And in the end, that's kind of what the Ukrainian citizens want. They just want to live like Europeans. Even the Russians in Ukraine would prefer to live in Europe than in a poor second world country that Ukraine and to some extent Russia is. I think this conflict could go on for decades, as after Russia defeats the Ukrainian military, they will have a difficult time occupying it, as there will be partisan activity, just like there was after World War II, as the Soviet-occupied Ukraine had a resistance going on into the 60s for 20 years after. So the Russia is going to have to put garrisons in every village and try to patrol this. But the problem is Russia might not have the motivation to pay for all of this, as this is going to hurt them economically a lot, as the sanctions have prevented the bank from selling its reserves, prevented its citizens from using SWIFT. Russian citizens are going to be very mad that they can't travel to Europe anywhere. Their soccer teams, which is very big in Russia, have been banned from all international competitions. So my opinion is that after about 5 years of occupation, there will probably be massive protests in Russia against continuing it, as there are too many bombs going off in random markets, and the garrisons keep getting attacked. And eventually the Russian troops will leave Ukraine, but perhaps keep the Donetsk and the Lugansk People's Republics, because those people have also been hurt by 8 years of Ukrainian army bombardment. So those people don't ever want to be in Ukraine. So my prediction is Russia will keep half of it, and the Western Ukraine will eventually get its independence back. And the Ukrainian government should recognize Crimea and the People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk as being part of Russia or independent, and Russia should withdraw the rest of its troops from other parts of Ukraine, and the healing can begin. Prisoners can be exchanged, new borders can be drawn, and hopefully Russia can find a way to transition into a more democratic government. I really wish Russia, after Putin, will have its own constitutional convention, just like America had after its Revolutionary War, because obviously their government is not working out very well, as Putin essentially hijacked the system and made all of Russians morally culpable in his actions.